If you're a Star Wars Unlimited fan in the South Jersey / Philly area, you're eating pretty good because there were another 2 showdowns with several more to come before the end of this season. Now, we're going to talk about one today that was held at a place that you may recognize, and that's Redcap's Corner. Shout out to them for supporting the game so much because not only did they host this showdown, but if you recall, a few weeks ago, they also hosted a 1K, and I'm hoping that they do so again in the future. Haven't heard any details on that. Maybe if they see this, let me know down in the comments. But we're going to talk about the lists that topped at that particular event. Now, I wasn't able to get a precise count prior to the recording. I know there were at least 20 people pre-registered, and based on events in the area that I've been to, there's a number of people who just show up the day of. So I'm going to guess mid-20s or so for this particular event. My understanding from talking to the organizer is that it was actually an interesting field, especially when you take in the context of the greater geographical area. And by that, I mean, I was told that there was a lot of Sabine and a lot of Vader. Now, of course, that isn't literally every deck, but notably, Boba hasn't been performing well at Redcaps. I know I was able to top 8 the 1K, but yeah, generally it doesn't seem to be putting up a great showing. However, when you go to other stores that aren't all that far away, things kind of flip. We get a ton of control at those other events, and additionally, Boba Fett does show up in much larger numbers and put up better numbers overall. So it's very interesting that the different areas, even when they are so physically close, can have such a dramatic difference in metagame, which is pretty cool to see. There's a lot of builds that are viable in this game, even this late into set 1. So as always, we're going to start at 8th, and then we're going to move our way up to 1st. So in 8th place, we actually have a Han Solo list. Han Green, naturally. I know there are other versions that are starting to creep up here and there, but this is clearly the dominant version of this particular leader. Now, as we're going through the list, there's a lot of things that seem fairly standard here. We, of course, have shaving of different numbers. There happen to be a lot of singletons, and we've talked about that before, where this game, due to the resource mechanic, allows you to get away with maybe some tech cards or other things that you could say wouldn't make the cut main deck, at least in a lot of other games. But here, you could main deck it and go, hey, this matchup isn't great for this. It's becoming a resource, and your decisions just became that easier, free up a little brain power for some other decisions. So in this case, we're looking at Singleton Mon Mothma, Singleton Akbar, Singleton Lackeys, Singleton Traitorous. These are all pretty interesting choices, especially in lieu of the generalized meta, especially at Redcaps. For whatever reason, as we talked about, Redcap seems to have a higher prevalence than other places locally as far as aggro goes. Now, beyond that, notably, there's also only 2 Leias, double Spark in the main, which is cool. 2 Waylays, squeezing in some rogue skirmishers. We see these kind of jump between the board and the main, depending on numbers. Other than that, it's pretty standard as far as I can tell. The board, of course, featuring Bamboozle, the extra Spark, some Bodies, Change of Heart, and Reinforcement Walkers. Now, the last one I want to call attention to because I know there's a number of players that I've spoken to that are really down on this card, and I'm kind of in the middle at the moment. Now, the context for the conversations with those other players were really surrounding Boba Green rather than Han, and obviously Han or other more dedicated ramp decks can actually ensure getting there, or that's their game plan, is to try and get to those later game cards. But I'd be curious to hear from this player or other players, if you've been playing Han or you've been playing Reinforcement Walker for that matter, to let me know in the comments whether you feel this is worth it, because it's weird. I've definitely played against it and said, oh, you want to take your turn off to Reinforcement Walker? That 3 life doesn't matter. You've now expended all your resources, you're dead. But that's me playing Boba Yellow. It doesn't seem like it'll be great in control matches. Like, I think you'd rather have other things, but I'm not sure, especially since Han is a heroism leader. You can't necessarily just go, oops, I'll just board in some Star Destroyers. Although maybe you can. I don't know. Just throwing the thought out there. One other thing I will call out that I neglected when we were briefly touching on the main deck, double Cunning main. Now, this is a tech choice that I'm surprised we're not seeing more often, to be perfectly honest. And we'll see if they show up in the other decks as we get there. But Cunning is brutal against a ton of things, but especially aggro, because it's essentially a time walk. Now, outside of double yellow, you're paying 6. So it can be kind of tough here, but Han is, of course, a ramp-based hero. So maybe this works. I'd love to hear how this worked out, because I know from being on the receiving end of Cunnings, both from opposing Boba Yellows, from blue-yellow control decks, that it can be absolutely crippling. But each of those decks utilize Cunning in different ways, but to extreme effect. Here, it feels like it's just going to buy you a turn, so it is a time walk, but you need to follow that turn up, and maybe this guarantees that Han shows up uncontested, or at least not immediately under fire. That could be the reason. Definitely very curious about that, but it's pretty cool to see some of these things starting to creep into other decks. Now, in 7th place, we have I want to say a newcomer. I don't think it's obviously not a new strategy. This is something that I think leapt out at just about everybody at some point, but definitely something that you don't see as frequently now. But I am personally very interested. I have a personal investment in this because I want to play some version of Vader Ramp. Now, in this case, we're looking at a more force-heavy build, but not quite all the way, I guess you could say, but we do certainly feature 5th Brother, not seeing 7th Sister. We do have Force Throw main deck, as well as double Force Surrender. So this appears to be somewhat of a concession, we'll say, to a metagame call. Specifically, this card is just not going to be good against aggro, right? Like, if you get to 6 resources, there are tons of other things you'd rather be doing than playing Force Surrender. I mean, don't get me wrong, there will be times where it's good, but with a 25 health base, notably, this is not Command Center. This is not a 30 health base. This is ECL. So you're taking your life in your hands here, especially leaning this heavy into the anti-control setup. It may not seem a lot with double Force Surrender, but you're already kind of in a hole due to the fact that you are playing a full set of resupply, full set of laser tech, which of course you can ECL into something to try and stabilize. But this means that if you take a turn off to resupply, every aggro deck internally fist bumps. Like, they are thrilled that you did nothing but resupply on whatever turn. Other than that, full sets of the early game Shore Troopers, Death Star Stormtroopers, as well as, well, actually, it's only 2 Viper probe droids, notably, but we are including Force Choke to help stabilize against a variety of things. I do like Force Choke. Yes, there are Force units in the 5th Brother, and of course, Vader himself. This allows you to get the discount, but most of the time, you're pretty comfortable paying 2. The card draw will come into play in certain matchups, but it is what it is. Now, thanks to ECL, the Consortium Star Viper naturally has a lot more value, but in talking to a lot of Boba players and a lot of other green control players, they haven't been thrilled with Star Viper, although it is playable. One thing that's notably missing both here in the main deck as well as the board is Colonel Yularen, and I'd be curious if, it isn't green heavy enough, I think, to really justify that. Notably also lacking is Darth Vader, the unit. Now, that may be a collection constraint. We, of course, have Ruck in the main deck as a singleton, as well as Mercenary Company. Now, Mercenary Company has been on the fringe from people talking about possibly including it because it isn't another ambush unit. But I'll be honest, those 3 slots between the 1 Ruck and the 2 Mercenary Company kind of scream to me, I don't have Vader, which, I can't really blame you. Like, Vader's expensive. Although notably, we do have double Vader's lightsaber in the deck. It can be removal when you need it. It's still useful even if you just slam it onto a random unit because you can represent a lot of damage. Rounding it out at the top end, we have Reinforcement Walkers and Palpatine. Notably, the Star Destroyers, specifically Relentless, are in the board. No Devastators could be another collection constraint. Admiral Piet, which is something that we've started to see creep into main decks, also in the board, the extra Force Choke. Stormtrooper Lieutenants, I'm not sure where they're coming in. There are certainly a lot of Imperials to begin with. Ruck even adds to the Imperial count, but it allows for some additional pressure maybe against control, or maybe you use it to try and get a surprise removal while adding to your board against aggro. I've definitely seen it in the main board. I'm not sure where it's going to be boarded in this particular scenario. But then we also have the extra Star Viper and Palpatine to round things out. Honestly, if this is a collection constraint, I absolutely understand it. If it is not, and it is a conscious choice, I'd love to hear from this player to find out why they made some of these choices, because some of them feel like it is just strictly the weaker option. It may not be strictly in the card game, strictly worse, strictly better sense. So always got to be careful about that. But it definitely seems to be putting this player at a disadvantage in a variety of matchups without those tools. However, it top aided, so shout out to them. It obviously was able to navigate the field, and given that there's such a prevalence of aggro, as I was told at this event, I wasn't able to attend this one, unfortunately. This is a pretty tough road to hoe with this particular deck. You can definitely fall behind, and I imagine, having not played a ton of games with Ramp, but on paper, Ramp should be kind of soft aggro because, as mentioned, you need to take time off to do super laser attacks or resupplies or whatever, and you may not be able to turn the corner. But either way, definitely a cool list. 6th place, we have Blonde Sabine, Yellow Sabine, this time with Chopper Base, in case you care whether it's Chopper Base or Administrator's Tower or something. Because some people are really hung up on which one it is, and I don't know why, but I know they are. But anyway, that's not the important part. We're looking at Yellow Sabine, and this list is starting to take over from Green Bean. And I guess Mono Red Sabine has always been kind of lurking on the periphery, but certainly has not jumped into prominence by comparison. I still think Green Bean is probably the most populous version, but the yellow one seems to be putting up some pretty decent numbers as well, definitely demanding some respect. Now, the cool tack here is we have Bamboozle in the main. So this is going to allow you to exhaust some units and get rid of upgrades. Presumably, this is to help out with Childson, because shields as well as experience count as upgrades. Is that worth it? I'm not sure. I'd have to find out from this player whether that really served them well on the day. It is, of course, a quote-unquote free card to play if you're doing the alternate cost of discarding a yellow card. So it does give you a way to try and punch through, but that's probably a 3-for-1 against Childson. I'd much rather have Spec Force, quite clearly, but you take what you can get when you can get it. After that, we're looking at double Heroic Sacrifice, only a singleton R2, which is a little odd. Only one Lothal Insurgent. I'm a little surprised by the lower count of Heroic Sacrifice, but you do have to make room somewhere. And notably, no Spark of Rebellion in the main and no Bodhi between the main or the board. Whether those should be there in both the Spark or the Bodhi in one or the other, of course, can be debated, but it's interesting when it's completely absent. Now, other than that, we are getting the full set of Leias compared to one of the earlier lists that we're looking at, and the rest of it seems pretty standard. I have to find out from a Yellow Sabine player. Chewie definitely seems super obnoxious against a lot of things, virtually everything, because he's tanky enough, he's Sentinel, he represents potentially a ton of damage if your opponent has to swing into him. But it still feels weird to play a 5-drop that isn't really helping you get there. I guess he kind of sort of has the Millennium Falcon trait of coming in untapped, air quotes. It's just a little weird. I'd be curious to hear from those players whether they feel that it is really worth it, or is it one of those, look, this is the best option we got. It's a set 1 meta. We only have so many cards. Now, moving from the main deck to the board, got Double Wolf, the rest of the Bamboozles. There's the Spark of Rebellion. Disabling Fangfighter notably only at 2, which is kind of surprising. Presuming that the Bamboozles are for Childson or other upgrades. So, for example, I guess you could Bamboozle a Traitorous. That doesn't seem great, but point is that you could try and bounce some of those things. I feel like you'd want the other Fangfighters instead, but notably for your 4 cause, I believe in Bamboozle is Heroism, whereas Fangfighter is not. So that could absolutely be as part of the consideration. And finishing it out with a Change of Heart, I presume that comes in for Chewie against control decks. That way you don't need the Sentinel as much with Chewie in those matchups, and then you could possibly steal whatever. You take whatever their big Sentinel is, you take whatever big thing or even medium-sized thing that they played, or even a little one just to push a little bit of extra damage and close the game out before they do something. Now, I've heard a lot of debate between aggro players about Wolf. Some people are loving it, some people are moving away from it, but as of late, I've seen people get more enthusiastic about it once again, just to ensure that your opponent isn't healing a significant amount on either a vigilance turn or other turns, just to eke out those extra points of damage. Plus, he paints a huge bullseye on his back just by existing, so that means that your other cards are freed up. So this list seems overall fairly standard other than the little bit of spice that's in there, but definitely pretty cool. Now in 5th place, we are back to Vader. Vader ramp, once again, this list has a number of differences between the previous one, whether it's moving things from the board to main deck, having different options in either, as well as, of course, a wildly different top end. So let's take a look. Our early game includes now the Snowtrooper Lieutenant, as well as TIE Fighter LN. I believe one of the players who had gone to one of the previous showdowns that I was at was running a list very similar to this, because I distinctly remember the TIE LNs. TIE LN obviously is not thrilling. You require the Snowtrooper Lieutenant, for example, to run the TIE into a Green Squadron A-Wing or something with a 3 on the back end in order to remove it, but it does give you a little bit of presence in space, so you have at least, something. Otherwise, you're giving up that entire arena for not a significant chunk of the game, but a good part of it. Maxing out on the probe droids and the Death Star Stormtroopers, cutting a seasoned short trooper. I'm a little surprised by that, because the short troopers, shockingly, or maybe not so shockingly, can become a big threat in the late game. All of a sudden, it's a 2-drop with a 4 attack, and getting to 6 resources is really, that's what this deck does. It does it very, very quickly. It's not that hard. So I'd be curious about that. Now, 2 Emperor's Royal Guard. I'm looking at the main deck, and I don't think there's a single official in the main deck. Question mark? I don't think there's a single official in the main deck. So that guy's just a 3/4 for 3, which is fine. But that seems a little odd. We have seen, for example, Craig's mono green list with Palpatine and some others put the Emperor's Royal Guard to great use. Here, you're not going to get the bonus because you don't have Palpatine, although I guess hypothetically you could. This list doesn't, but you could be running red Palpatine. But without any officials, it doesn't have Sentinel, so it's just going to be a 3/4 body, which is fine. But I presume this was, you really want it to be a Sentinel. Now, we do have some officials on the board, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but run the full set of Star Vipers, the resupplies, and technicians. I have seen some lists cut down to 5, which seems a little weird. That's counter to the entire game plan of the deck. But we do have Strike True, which was notably absent from the previous list, and I think this is a great way to help stabilize, especially in space. For example, Death Star Stormtrooper can Strike True into space, and your opponent, especially an aggro opponent, probably doesn't want to run into the Stormtrooper unless they have Unit Sabine, in which case you're just having a bad day all around. But Strike True does give you a somewhat cheap option to try and slow down your opponent by eliminating things. Cell block guards, Imperial Interceptors, Barrage, Raiders, here are the Vaders. But when we get to the top end, we are still seeing Reinforcement Walkers, but we're also adding in a 3-set, 2-in-1 of Star Destroyers, 2 Relentless and a Devastator. Relentless, obviously, huge against everything, but amazing against control because it shuts off their first removal card, thereby guaranteeing a 2-for-1 at minimum on the Relentless. And then, of course, Devastator is just enormous. All right, I'm going to clear your board. Well, not clear your board, but I'm going to completely annihilate that thing, control the board. Seems pretty good. Now, as far as the board goes, we do have Colonel Yularen, the aforementioned official, gives you some extra healing. Personally, I would kind of want to see those in the main deck. I could possibly see, say, the Stormtrooper Lieutenants coming out, maybe the TIEs. That does mess with your Imperial account, sort of, because he is Imperial himself, even though he doesn't have the villainy trait. But the reason you want to remove those is because you want to maintain the minimum green count that's necessary for him. I don't have a particular number in mind, but you obviously don't want to cut green cards in order to fit him in. I could see potentially cutting the ties and the snow troopers if you're expecting a lot of aggro. Get the Ularans main deck, get the extra season shore trooper, and then you have a higher green count and you have, well, right now, that would be the only healing available to the deck, at least from this list. Now, we have Homestead Militia, which has shown up in other decks in the past. Little abnormal here, but, I mean, makes sense. Additionally, we have Escort Skiff to also help out against aggro. This player clearly was more concerned with that, especially given that they're already running the Star Destroyer's main. You don't need to board into as many. However, there is still Forced Surrender, which I think is a great tool in order to help fight control. This seems much more well-rounded. I would definitely love to hear from the players how they thought their aggro matchups went because of the 25 health base. Even with this sort of boarding plan, I think it would be relatively trivial to just go, oops, I lose into an aggro matchup. There isn't a ton of Sentinel. The Sentinels you have, like one of them costs 10, which, yeah, you're a ramp deck, but like, okay, that's 10. That's a lot. The removal can be sketchy because Strike True needs something else. It has to be big enough also. Overwhelming Barrage is obviously great, but you need to, once again, ensure that you have a board if your opponent's playing around it, either via discard or just clearing out your stuff, and you may just not have stuff at the time. It can be a little dangerous to try and accomplish these things. So the 25 health base versus a 30 health one, like I said, I'd love to hear their thoughts on it, or anybody else's for that matter, on this particular list. So remember how I said that the mono red Sabine wasn't quite as popular? It's still pretty successful. It's definitely still putting up numbers. And it's interesting talking to Ben, the organizer for this, for the event at Redcaps, mentioning that on the 4th, every Sabine deck was green. However, for this showdown, they were all yellow, and then this singular mono red Sabine, which is pretty awesome. Shout out to this player, as well as all the players, of course, but shout out to this player for being the sole Sabine red in the room and still top 8ing, getting to a top 4 as well. Now, we don't have the sideboard for this particular list. I don't know if that was an oversight or if they just literally didn't have a sideboard, because, you know, for some of these events, these showdowns are billed as intending to be more of a casual event than a hyper-competitive one. So I wouldn't be surprised if players just showed up and said, hey, you know what? I have my 50. I'm just playing this. I don't care. And with an aggro deck, maybe your main deck is just good enough. I don't know. But in any case, this one definitely making some changes compared to the earlier Sabine. So we do see Metal Ceremonies here. Only a Singleton Rebel Assault, but full set of Heroic Sacrifice. Full set of R2-D2s. We do have the Rebel Pathfinder, but I think that might just be a concession to, hey, we kind of need to fill stuff out. You, of course, don't have access to Battlefield Marine. I mean, I guess technically you do, but please don't do that. You're going to have a bad day, at least in these lists. Singleton Open Fire, which is something that I've talked to other Red Sabine players about, and they have all mentioned either wanting it in the main deck or included in the sideboard so that they have access to it, because sometimes you just need to get something out of the way, or at worst, if you have to 2-for-1 yourself to clear a Child Sin or something else big, you got to do what you got to do as long as you're continuing to push damage. Double Saw in the main, that's something that the numbers sometimes change about, and then 2 Dodona. That, of course, can help you break some numbers, hit some breakpoints in the mirror, or just present, surprise, my whole board is just way more threatening. Like Dodona, if you think about it, and this is all, of course, assuming that your opponent doesn't necessarily respond, and of course they're going to, but work with me here. You play the Dodona, if you have 3 guys out, that's 3 extra damage, +1/+1 on each of them. So you can kind of think of it as a different style of Fleet Lieutenant. Clearly worse from the you don't get to attack immediately perspective, but it still can present both a threat itself as well as improving the rest of your board. So this is a pretty cool list. A lot of it seems fairly standard. Of course, we're always going to be talking about the tiny wrinkles, what they expected, what they didn't. Rebel Assault at a lower number. I think this player was expecting less aggro, more control, because that's why they have Heroic Sacrifice, or at least that seems to be the general mentality for these pumps. Based on what I was told, that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, I guess there's a lot of ramp Vader, but then also a ton of Sabine. So the fact that this player was able to fight through that field, possibly they had other Rebel assaults on the board, which notably that's going to cost them extra, something I didn't mention before. But if that card's important enough, sometimes that's what does it. So this is pretty cool to have those particular techs in this list. So our third place finisher, unfortunately, didn't make their deck list public on SWODB. It happens sometimes. I will put the link in the description so that way, if it pops up, we can actually get to take a peek. But my understanding is that they were running Han Green, which, given the meta that was present, is pretty interesting. I kind of got all my thoughts out with the other Han Green, especially without seeing the list. I think we're kind of at where we are as far as those lists go, but if you got some spice, let me know. Now, we do have information on our second place finisher, our finalist, if you will, and that is Yellow Luke. This is actually pretty spicy because this is not something you commonly see. Luke, I think I've only exclusively seen green Luke. I don't think I've ever seen a yellow Luke in the wild, we'll call it. But this one clearly performed very well, and there's a lot to take in this list. I mean, you have your standard blue stuff. You're seeing some lightsabers. You're seeing the restored arcs. You have, of course, Luke Unit, Obi-Wan, Redemption. Those are kind of standard. But it's the yellow piece that gives you access to a lot of other cool elements. I mean, you have additional 1-drops in Chopper, which also notably helps out Kanan Jarrus, which is kind of interesting. Not only does it provide a buff, but now Kanan's also self-buffing because you have an extra Spectre. There's a lot of minor quirks there that are pretty cool. Additionally, you're getting access to Millennium Falcon, as well as Edra Bridger, who is a nightmare coming out of Han decks. You're not going to ramp into it here and play it on turn 1, but it certainly is a sizable body that can give you some card advantage by allowing you to get quote-unquote free plays when it swings in. Additionally, you get a full playset here of Spark of the Rebellion, which is intensely disruptive. And I'd love to know how that performed throughout the day, given the particular field. But I imagine that if you're stripping things from Vader, whether it's the ramp cards themselves, what they're trying to ramp into, or an overwhelming barrage, whatever it is, there's a huge amount of targets, and you don't really have any restrictions on what you're hitting. So seems pretty good, especially if you can present a threat like Kanan Jarrus or any of the other cards and then continue to apply pressure. Of course, Yoda helps you stabilize. Fleet Lieutenants seem pretty standard. And here's the kicker. You have almost full play sets of Vigilance and Cunning. We're running 2 Vigilance, 3 Cunning. I'd be curious about that split, or I am curious about that split. Finalist, if you're out there, let me know why you went with 2-3 instead of 3-2 or the full play set. This could be a collection restraint. It could be a metagame call because Cunning, still good against aggro, but also provides more utility against control because of the actual attack buff, as long as, you're dodging their sets of removals and making sure you're playing around what they can do. But given that you can provide shields to things with the Luke leader, it's possible that you can dodge some significant amount of removal or certainly combat. The Vigilance could provide value against control, but here it's going to do less just because you don't have access to restocks. You're not setting up the loops. You really are going to be the aggro in those control matchups with this particular list because, well, they're clearly going to be running Vigilance. And if they have restocks and you don't Vigilance and hit triple Vigilance, triple restock, you're probably not milling them, right? That being said, you do have an additional mill tool in Kanan Jarrus, so maybe that is the option? I don't know. This is all pretty spicy. I'm pretty excited about this list. But let's talk about the sideboard. You have Confiscates. Okay, I guess for Traitorous, probably entrenched on Luke Leader would be super obnoxious, but that gives you a cheaper way to get out from under it. The final copy of Sneak Attack, I imagine sneaking out, whether it's Redemption against aggro to try and get it out earlier, get a big heal, maybe, smack something while also holding it down until it has to get removed inevitably via the Sentinel. Bodhi to help out in the control matchups. Now we see the Vigilance, the third copy in the board. So clearly have some ideas in mind. We were already talking about where it would be valuable. I'd be curious which matchups it ultimately did come in against, or whether it came in all the time, because I could see it kind of go either way. Triple Vanquish, presumably for control, because now it just gives you an easy way. Hey, you have a Star Destroyer? Now you don't. Oh, you played Vader? Not so much. Palpatine? Get the hell out of here. Extra copy of Obi-Wan and Redemption, presumably those are coming in against more aggressive opponents, try and lock down the board. Now, me as the Boba Yellow player, I'm happy to see Obi-Wan hit the board. It takes up basically your entire turn, or most likely your entire turn, and I'm going to Cantina Bouncer it. But against other aggressive options, the Sabines and the Leias of the world definitely can lock the board down and cause a lot of trouble. But this is pretty cool. I would love to know what this player played against on their way to the finals, because we know there was a lot of Vader and a lot of Sabine. Clearly, those weren't the only decks, but this is something that's just so out of the ordinary. I'd love to hear more about this. So if you're out there playing Yellow Luke, let me know, because this is pretty sick. All the way at the end, first place, it's Sabine Yellow once again. A slightly tweaked version from what we saw earlier. Only 2 Spec Forces main deck, only 2 Rogue Operatives main deck. I feel like that is one of the main reasons to be in Yellow Sabine, is the Rogue Operatives. I mean, yes, obviously Falcons are important, Spectre, and Surprise Attack, and Sneak Attack, and Leia's, and I guess I'm now convincing myself that it isn't as high on the list of priorities as I thought it was, but it does seem like it's one of your better options, so I'm kind of surprised to see it only as a 2 of here. 2 Heroic Sacrifice, notably no Rebel Assault, and once again, 0 Medal Ceremonies, which I would have thought were sacred, we'll say, in Sabine lists, that you want them against everything, but maybe Yellow Sabine doesn't really require it. It's something that I'm going to have to keep in the back of my head as we look at more of these deck lists and more of these events, whether those are featuring prominently or they're getting left on the cutting room floor. The rest of the main deck, pretty standard. 2 Lothal Insurgents. The Oz Attack is there. Notably, the Chewies are in the board, so that kind of segues into where we're going to look next. 2 Chewies in the board, the other Spec Force, only a Singleton Wolf, but triple Bamboozle and 2 Disabling Fang Fighters. We saw the Bamboozles in the main earlier. The Fang Fighters have been at 2, we've seen. I guess this is pretty standard for it. Now that I'm looking at it, I already laid out the reasons why I would have thought that it would be different otherwise, but I'm also not a Yellow Sabine player. I still need to try this list because it seems fun. My wife has been playing Sabine Green. Definitely want to give her another option, because we've run into some challenges, and I think a lot of these Yellow Sabines / Red Sabines are solving some of those challenges. Now, lastly, we have the full set of the Ozatuk Liberator Gunship. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's the gunship. Definitely sounds cool, but another 3/4 ambush. I could see this having value in a variety of matchups. There's a lot of smaller space units that you can eat up, or like a 7th Fleet at the worst, trade with. The combination of this and other things allows you to take down Fett's Fire Spray, although clearly that's not what you're going to want to do if you can help it. But this seems to be more where Sabine Yellow is, so let me know what your thoughts are for this one. So that's our top 8. Now, like I said at the beginning, Redcaps has been supporting Star Wars Unlimited in an incredible fashion thus far, with their previous 1K, with this Showdown, and I know they're running pre-release events. So I actually just saw that in their Discord. The notification came up while I was recording. So shout out to them for doing all of this stuff. I would love to see them run more 1Ks in the future. Obviously, I'm sure we're going to get more Showdowns as the future sets come out. But let me know how you're doing in your Showdowns, what you think of this top 8, and where you think the meta is going, because we are closing in pretty soon on the Set 2 release. Got to get in that Set 1 gameplay while you can. That's going to do it for this time. So as always, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Tune in next time for more Random's Thoughts.